From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
Tonight, I want to take you back to September 16th, 1994, to a small schoolyard in Ruwa, Zimbabwe. 60 children are outside for recess when something strange appears in the sky. Moments later, it lands. And what happens next becomes one of the most remarkable mass UFO sightings ever recorded. The witnesses? All school children. The accounts? Uncannily consistent. And the implications? Well, they reach far beyond that dusty playground. This is the story of the Ariel School Encounter. And the question that's haunted investigators for decades: did something otherworldly really visit that day? Or was it something far more human and just as mysterious? This is From the Void. Ruwa, Zimbabwe. A bright September morning in 1994. Dozens of school children are on recess when something silvery streaks across the sky and lands near the brush line. What they say they saw next would change their lives and puzzle investigators for decades. This is the story of the Ariel School Encounter, an event some call the most credible mass UFO sighting of the modern era. Friday, September 16th, 1994. Around 10 a.m., roughly 62 pupils ages 6 to 12 were let loose into the playground at Ariel School in the farming town of Ruwa. The school sat at the edge of farmland, surrounded by flat, sun-baked ground dotted with scrubby bush and thorn trees. Beyond the playground's fence was a stretch of open veld, low brush, sandy soil, tufts of dry grass. A line of dense trees created a natural boundary at the far edge, almost like a wall of green that separated the schoolyard from the wild. On that morning, the children played as usual, kicking balls, chasing each other, clumping in little groups across the dusty schoolyard. But unlike most recess periods, there were no teachers watching from the sidelines. Every adult was indoors for a staff meeting. So when the first shouts rang out, "Look, over there," it was only children who turned toward the tree line. What they described seeing was extraordinary. A silvery, disc-like object descending into the scrub. Some said it hovered just above the ground. Others swore it touched down on the soil. And then, figures. Small, dark-clad beings with elongated heads and large, staring eyes. A wave of panic rolled through the playground. Some of the younger children screamed and ran back toward the buildings. Others stood rooted, watching in shock. A few of the older ones claimed the beings moved closer, gliding through the brush toward the boundary of the playground itself. One boy told investigators it was like something out of space, like you see in the films. A girl described the figure's face. The eyes were frightening. The eyes looked at me. They were big and black and long. Another child insisted the beings didn't speak, but somehow she still understood it. It just felt it wanted to say something. Like we mustn't be too techno. Pollution mustn't be. And over, the children repeated the same details in their drawings and their words. Shiny disc, small body, large head, eyes that locked with theirs. According to the children, the encounter lasted somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes. Long enough for the figures to be seen moving near the brush. Long enough for panic and awe to ripple across the playground. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the craft and its occupants were gone. Whether they vanished into the trees or rose into the air depends on which child you ask. But all agreed. When it was over, the schoolyard was buzzing with fear and confusion. With no teachers outside, the first adults to learn of it were the staff inside the school, alerted by frightened children pouring back into the classrooms. At first, the head teacher, Colin Mackey, didn't know what to make of it. Kids sometimes invent stories, but the sheer number of children reporting the same thing and their emotional state couldn't be ignored. That afternoon, children were asked individually to describe what they had seen. Many also drew pictures: silvery discs, black-clad figures with large eyes. Those drawings would soon become central to the case. By the following day, news of the incident had begun to spread throughout the local community. Parents heard strange and frightening stories from their children. Some were dismissive, chalked it up to imagination, but others were alarmed by how consistent the children's accounts were. The drawings from the day before circulated among staff and families. The images, saucer-shaped craft, small beings with large black eyes, were unusual, even unnerving, coming from such young children. On the third day, the story reached outside ears. One of Africa's leading UFO researchers, Cynthia Hind, was notified and began making arrangements to visit the school. That same day, BBC correspondent Tim Leach learned of the case. Leach had covered war, political upheaval, and violence across Africa, but he later admitted that what he found at Ariel School disturbed him more than anything else. 60 children, each insisting that they had seen something extraordinary. Their sincerity left him deeply unsettled. Hind arrived at the school, interviewed children in small groups, and collected dozens of their drawings. Soon after, Leach returned with a BBC camera crew to capture the children's testimony. What began as a quiet Friday morning recess had within a week become an international story. And just 2 months later, Harvard psychiatrist John Mack would step off a plane in Harare, bringing the case to a whole new level of global attention. Before we move forward in the timeline, it's worth pausing on one of the most enduring artifacts of the Ariel School Encounter, the drawings. After the sighting, children were asked, first by their teachers, later by investigator Cynthia Hind, to put to paper what they had seen. The sketches are hauntingly consistent. Round silver discs, dark small-bodied figures, large almond-shaped eyes. Dozens of children working separately produce variations on the same image. On the surface, that consistency feels damning, like evidence that something extraordinary really did land near the school that day. But to understand the value and the limits of those drawings, it helps to borrow a lens from criminal investigation. Imagine a car accident on a busy street. 10 witnesses are interviewed. Some agree on the color of the car. Some remember the speed. Others contradict each other about who had the right of way. A skilled investigator knows that eyewitness testimony, especially in groups, is both powerful and unreliable. Human memory isn't a video recorder. It's a living thing, prone to suggestion, contamination, and the pressure of shared storytelling. At Ariel, the children were mostly interviewed in groups. One child's description could easily influence another's. A fearful classmate could amplify the tension in the room. Now, that doesn't mean that their accounts were false, but it does mean we have to weigh them with caution, the way an accident investigator weighs 10 contradictory stories to try and triangulate the truth. So while the drawings are undeniably compelling, they're also tricky. Do they represent independent testimonies, or do they show how easily details can spread in a crowd of frightened children? To understand the Ariel case, we can't just look at what the children said. We also have to look closely at how they were interviewed. Because in any investigation, whether it's a car accident, a crime scene, or a UFO sighting, the methods shape the evidence. When Cynthia Hind, Africa's leading UFO researcher, arrived at Ariel just a few days later, she gathered groups of children together, sometimes 6 or 7 at a time, and asked them to describe what they saw. While she meant well, this group setting came with a risk. One child's description could ripple through the group, shaping what others remembered or felt pressured to say. Psychologists call this contagion of memory. Hind also asked questions in ways that may have nudged the children in a certain direction. Instead of starting with open-ended prompts like, "Tell me what happened," she sometimes framed questions around what she had already heard. For example, "Did you see the man in black?" This isn't unusual for UFO investigations, but it's a red flag for anyone concerned with preserving untainted testimony. 2 months later, Harvard psychiatrist John Mack conducted his own interviews. He filmed one-on-one sessions, which helped reduce peer pressure. But Mack came with his own baggage. He was already deeply interested in alien abduction cases and their psychological meaning. His questions sometimes reflected that. When a child mentioned the figure's eyes, Mack followed up. "Did the eyes make you feel anything? Did they give you a message?" Not surprisingly, it was during Mack's interviews that children began speaking about telepathic warnings, messages about technology and pollution. It's impossible to say whether those themes were present all along or whether Mack's line of questioning helped bring them out. In forensic psychology, best practice is to interview witnesses separately, as soon as possible, using neutral prompts, letting them speak in their own words without suggestion. At Ariel, these conditions weren't met. Hind's group interviews risked cross-contamination, and Mack's framing risked leading responses. Now, that doesn't erase what the children described, but it does mean we have to handle the record carefully, understanding that both the content and the method are part of the story. To really understand what happened in Ruwa, you have to rewind the clock, back 2 nights before the children's encounter. On the evening of September 14th, 1994, thousands of people across southern Africa looked up and saw fire in the sky. A massive streak of light tore across the night, breaking into glowing fragments. Phones lit up at radio stations. Newspapers were flooded with calls. To many, it looked like the arrival of a UFO armada. In reality, it was the re-entry of a Russian rocket booster, Cosmos 2290, burning up in the atmosphere. Astronomers identified it, satellite trackers logged it, but for the people who saw it, the experience was anything but mundane. It was strange, awe-inspiring, and unsettling. And here's where psychology comes into play. When a community sees something unexplainable in the sky, it primes the imagination. It creates a readiness to interpret when dozens of children in Ruwa thought they saw a craft in the brush 2 mornings later. It wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was happening in a community already buzzing with talk of UFOs. The Cosmos 2290 re-entry 2 nights earlier had been dramatic, but it was seen from a great distance, high overhead, as a spectacle in the night sky. Bright, silent fragments slowly drifting like burning embers. The Ariel sighting was completely different. It wasn't lights far away in the sky. It was a physical presence close to the ground, just beyond the soccer field. Close enough, children said, to see the figure's eyes. And that contrast matters. One was distant and explained, the other was immediate and unexplained. And here's something worth remembering about testimony. Investigators, whether they're working car crashes or crime scenes, rarely expect every witness to tell an identical story. In fact, if everyone's account matches perfectly, it can be a red flag for collusion. What investigators look for is consensus on the core details, while discarding the noise of minor discrepancies. 10 witnesses to a traffic accident may disagree on whether the car was red or maroon, whether it was going 40 or 50. But if 9 of them say it ran the stoplight, that's the detail that sticks. At Ariel, the children's stories diverged on small things: how tall the beings were, whether the craft touched the ground or hovered just above. But on the essentials, silver disc, dark figure, large staring eyes, the accounts lined up again and again. That consistency is one reason the case has endured. Another compelling piece of the story was what happened in the immediate aftermath of the events of that Friday. Later that evening, parents began hearing the story, and many came to the school the next day to ask what had happened. Over the following days, the children's fear and disturbance persisted. Emotion cuts both ways in investigations. It can signal a genuine stressful event, and it can also cement a shared memory as people retell it. Here, both appear to be in play. Intense immediate fear followed by rapid documentation, the drawings and statements, that preserved the children's core details without introducing adult eyewitnesses who could confirm or contradict them. In the days after the sighting, the Ariel School was buzzing. Children had drawn dozens of pictures, parents were unsettled, teachers were left without answers. And that's when the outside investigators began to arrive. The first was Cynthia Hind, who we talked about earlier. Next came Tim Leach, the BBC correspondent we also mentioned earlier. Leach was no stranger to crisis. He'd covered the Rhodesian War and the violence that followed. Leach was struck not by the drawings, but by the children themselves, their demeanor, their consistency, their fear. He broadcast the story, and suddenly the Ariel encounter was no longer just a schoolyard mystery. It was international news. Then, 2 months later, John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist we also mentioned earlier, flew to Zimbabwe. Mack was already famous and controversial for his research into alien abduction experiences. He filmed one-on-one interviews with the children, asking not only what they had seen, but how it made them feel. It was during those interviews that new elements surfaced. Some children said they felt the beings had communicated silently through their eyes, warning about technology and environmental destruction. Don't get too techno, pollution mustn't be. Critics argue Mack's line of questioning may have influenced these themes. Supporters say his gentle approach allowed children to open up about the deeper layers of their experience. Either way, Mack's involvement cemented the Ariel case as one of the most discussed and debated sightings in modern UFO history. So in just a matter of weeks, Ariel went from frightened kids on a dusty playground to a case studied by UFO researchers, broadcast by the BBC, and scrutinized by an Ivy League psychiatrist. What had begun as recess at a rural school was now a story ricocheting around the world. One thing that's important to note before we move on is that not every child stayed by the playground. Some of the older pupils, braver or simply more curious, ventured towards the edge of the brush where the object had descended. These became known as the close witnesses. One girl later said, "I saw a little man about as tall as me, dressed in black. He had big eyes, and he was moving closer." Another described the figure differently. "It was tall and thin. Its head was very big." Some swore the being glided across the grass. Others insisted it simply appeared and then vanished. A few even drew the craft as if it rested on landing legs, while most described it hovering silently just above the ground. And here's where things get complicated. The children who claimed the closest view gave the most detail, but also the most variation. Was the figure short or tall? Did the craft hover or land? Did it last minutes or only moments? Psychologists would say that's exactly what you'd expect. Witnesses nearest a stressful event notice more, but they rarely notice the same things. Those farther away watching from the playground described only the broad strokes: a silvery disc, dark figures, large eyes. The essentials matched, even if the close-up details didn't. So at Ariel, the testimony fits a familiar pattern from accident scenes and crime investigations. The closer you are, the more vivid the memory, and the more room for differences. The farther away, the simpler and more uniform the story. It's those core details that carried through the entire group: disc, figure, eyes. Decades have passed since that Friday morning in Ruwa, and yet, for many of these children, the memory has not faded. In recent documentaries like Ariel Phenomenon and Netflix Encounters, now adult witnesses describe the same events with the same haunting conviction. One woman recalls, "I've never stopped thinking about it. It was burned into my mind." Another says, "When I looked into those eyes, I knew it was real." For skeptics, the consistency after so many years is proof of a story reinforced by repetition. But for the witnesses themselves, the very fact that they can't shake the memory is what makes it real. What about physical evidence? Did anyone go out into the brush where the children claimed the craft landed? The answer is yes. Both teachers and investigators reportedly inspected the site, but no definitive traces were found. No scorched earth, no landing impressions, nothing you could bag, tag, and send to a lab. Some children insisted the craft pressed into the grass, and a few adults noted that the ground seemed trampled. But if there were marks, they didn't last. Today, there's no material proof left from the encounter, only drawings, interviews, and memories. And yet, those memories are strikingly consistent. From 1994 to today, the core story remains the same: a silvery disc, one or more small figures, large black eyes, fear that seared itself into young minds. 3 decades later, we're left with a paradox. No physical evidence, no adult eyewitnesses, but dozens of children, now adults, still insisting they saw something that morning, something that has never left them. In the weeks after the sighting, Ariel School was never quite the same. The drawings were tucked into folders. Investigators came and went. Reporters filed their stories. And then, 2 months later, Harvard psychiatrist John Mack arrived. The message the children conveyed to Mack during his visit is one I want to come back to for a moment. The message itself isn't unique. In 1961, Betty and Barney Hill spoke of telepathic impressions from their abductors. Even before that, in the 1950s, George Adamski claimed space visitors warned him about nuclear weapons. Across decades of close encounter stories, there's a pattern. Messages not about conquering the Earth, but about saving it. Skeptics point out how these themes mirror the anxieties of their time. Cold War nuclear fear, 1990s environmentalism. Believers argue that the very consistency across cultures and decades suggests a real phenomenon, with a message humanity keeps refusing to hear. So what happened at Ariel School in 1994? Here's what we can say for certain. Around 60 children described something incredible. Drawings, testimony, and memories that have endured for nearly 3 decades. There were no adult eyewitnesses, no physical evidence, only the conviction of children who are now adults who have steadfastly stuck to their story. A silvery disc, small figures in black, large staring eyes, and maybe a message meant for all of us. Thanks for listening to From the Void. I'm John Williamson.